Ani Bajo, welcome everyone. This is Victoria here from the Bagida'waad Alliance, and I have a very, very special guest with me tonight. Alison Cuffley is with us from British Columbia, the other side of Turtle Island. So we're really excited to have you, Alison. I was lucky to be able to meet Alison in person not too long ago, where we got to go on a big, long hike and get to see lots of fossils and interesting animals, and just having a beautiful day outside and getting to know each other better. So I'm really glad that we can kind of stay in touch, and that you're able to be free here for our series, because we've been doing these presentations. We've got some support from the Canadian government in order to be able to do some presentations, and we had some from the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, and we had it from somewhere else too. I forget. But anyway, we've been getting this lovely support from people. So we're really happy to be able to bring really interesting and speakers and talking about meaningful things with everyone. So G Miigwech for everybody that is here. And I know Alison is planning to give a bit of a presentation, but she's open to having questions whenever people have them. You can raise your hand or you can put them in the chat, and because Alison is going to be multitasking while she's talking, and she'll be able to keep track of what's going on. But Natasha, as another host, will also be able to do that and be able to help with facilitating if it's needed. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Alison. We're so happy to have you here, and I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Victoria. Thank you, Victoria, Natasha, and Bagida'waad Alliance for inviting me to come here today. I'm really excited. I got to know you both, when we had the visit and kind of through the work of the Jane Goodall Institute, but I'm so excited to come here and talk about something that I'm really passionate about. I'd love to kind of get started, which is great. Thank you, everyone who's attending live. It's wonderful. So my name is Alison Cuffley, and I grew up on the West Coast, but I've been really fortunate to live and travel to a lot of different places in my life. So I'm just so grateful and humbled to be here in everyone's presence and being able to kind of share my passion about this specific subject, which is kind of generally Indigenous priorities, government policies, but what really I want to talk about is successes, and then also some failures in terms of incorporating Indigenous worldview and Indigenous priorities into those policies. So I'd like to introduce myself. My mom's family is Ukrainian and German. Her parents are Hugh Wiebe and Elsie Freiheit. My father's family is Tsleil-Waututh, formerly called the Burrard Indian Band. Their traditional lands are the territories surrounding the Burrard Inlet, and they overlap territories with the Downriver Halkomelem-speaking peoples of Musqueam Nation, as well as the Squamish-Snitchin-speaking peoples of Squamish Nation. So very grateful. I live in what is now called Vancouver. This is stolen land of all of those nations, and that's where I am speaking to you from right now. My grandfather on my father's side was Benjamin Bruce, and my grandmother was Florence Thomas. So I want to honor my ancestors and honor everyone else's ancestors, because that's the reason we get to be together and speak today. Bit more about me. I'm a daughter, I'm a partner, I'm a sister, and I'm an auntie to two awesome nibblings named William and Patrick. The adorable little Patrick here on the left, and then there's Will holding him on the right. I'm absolutely obsessed. I'm the Indigenous Relations Manager for the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada now. I'm relatively new to this role. I started just at the beginning of March of this year. And prior to that, as you may have figured out, given the title of my presentation, is that I worked for the BC SPCA, which is the BC Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, for most of my career, kind of starting when I was 19. I started working in the shelters and the branches directly with the animals. Through my time there, through my very long tenure there, I did a variety of jobs. I went from animal control, behavior modification, basic medical intakes, and through my work, especially through our night emergency service, as well as just regular ambulatory calls, I realized that the human intersection with wildlife has become quite unstable, especially in such a busy area like Vancouver. So that's what kind of started my interest in making this wider impact, because I saw the ability of, as wonderful it is to help one dog, one cat, one rabbit, that I really wanted to do something that was so much more impactful for animals as a whole. So my last position with the BCSPCA was actually government relations, and that's where I was really able to do policy work that invigorated me. It was related to our advocacy campaign, policy development in partnership with First Nations and Indigenous communities. Specifically for that, I did things like animal control laws, help connect them with spay-neuter providers, we humane education projects for better animal welfare in the communities, and through all of this, again, I found real interest slash horror realization that the ways that the government policy can totally be developed devoid of any meaningful consultation with the people that it impacts the most, whether you're a small little municipality or whether it's the provincial government making decisions about things that impact everyone in the province. So again, today I'm so honored to be able to join you all today to have this conversation. I hope that what I have to say is interesting and informative. It's a big part of my work life, and I've got a lot to say. So as Victoria mentioned, if you have any questions, just ask them whenever. Like, put your hand up, put them in the chat, whatever you want, or you can save them to the end, and maybe we can have a bit of a Q&A there if you have any other questions. So basically, the outline of this project is I just want to do some successes about times where centering and uplifting Indigenous-led organizations and First Nations themselves were the reason for successful policy change. And then I was thinking a lot about this, but I think we've all had enough bad news lately. It's pretty heavy. So I wanted to talk about one thing in particular, which I'm very interested in, which is government fail, which is the decision to renew a wolf call in BC. So make sure you ask questions as much as possible, and thank you for being here again. So right here, I have kind of a non-exhaustive list of all the recent successes for animal welfare. These are specific instances where Indigenous voices were either taking the lead or that they partnered with other NGOs and animal welfare organizations to make that change. So I'm going to be starting with the mink farming ban in BC because that's something that I was quite involved with, so I know the most about it. Secondly, we have the Jane Goodall Act, which is currently living in the Senate, which is impacting my current role and wonderfully has been brought forward by 2 Indigenous senators. And then we have the grizzly bear trophy hunting ban, which is in the Owikano and Heiltsuk territories, kind of Great Bear Rainforest in the province as well. And then we also have a recent ruling in Quebec, which is about animal sentience, which is kind of a very interesting lead into what I would love to see, which is more of a granting of like personhood for nature and non-human animals so that people like us are able to advocate on their behalf, much in the same way that children often get legal representation on behalf of themselves. So we can start here. So as I mentioned, I was part of the campaign that led to a ban of mink farming in BC in 2021. So I wanted to start off with that because that's what I'm the most knowledgeable about. And if I don't stop myself, then I will just chat your ear off about mink farming for hours. So let's be reasonable. Here we have a picture of that was actually taken on a fur farm here in BC. So you can see the kind of cage size and the animals themselves. So as you can probably guess, fur farming as an industry is inherently inhumane. They basically take wild animals, they breed them, and they stock them as products in captivity. So even after generations of hand raising, of selective breeding, these animals are wild in nature. They still have the exact same animal welfare needs of their wild counterparts, and they still need to exhibit the exact same behavior in order to live a life worth living. Something that I wanted to bring into the conversation just this once and then not bring it up again is that a really weird capitalistic viewpoint just point blank about fur farming in our country is that commercial fur farming actually limits the economic opportunities of Indigenous people. They flood the market with industrially raised goods, and then those processes are inherently in conflict with traditional Indigenous values. So if you wanted to just take a look through strictly a capitalistic lens, is that this is just not good business to be flooding a market with all of these goods meant for strictly export into luxury markets. Very few, if any, of the fur produced in Canada actually stays in Canada. It's all shipped away to be processed and then shipped even further away to be sold to people. So mink in particular are an interesting case because during the pandemic, it was found that mink actually carry the virus that causes COVID-19. So I'm sure if they were one of the original carriers, if it's just something that they're particularly susceptible to the way that humans were, but there has been cases of human-animal and animal-human transmission of the virus via mink. And we know this because in June of 2020, so shortly after the pandemic was named and called a pandemic, Denmark and other European countries proactively culled their mink populations after these types of transmissions. Keep in mind, these are countries where their export numbers of this fur is so much higher than Canada. In BC, there were 9 mink farms. In Denmark, it's something that's worth about 16 million euros a year. So huge difference in the population size in the countries, as well as huge amount of economic benefit for each. But they did make the decision to cull all of those mink as soon as it was found out that they could be carriers for COVID-19. As we know, when you go human-animal or animal-human, that's how variants happen. And it also can risk reducing vaccine efficacy efforts going forward. In Denmark, it also made it extremely difficult to go through the process of weaning the babies away from the parents because they have to handle the animals a lot of that time. So if you know that you can't have proper protections, as adorable as it might be in our heads to think of mink with little tiny masks on, they just can't do that. They have to get in there. The animals have to be close to them. So this is what's necessary for there to be a fur harvest. It was just unavoidable. So I was really honored and humbled to work with the staff of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. So I'll be abbreviating that to UBCIC, and Kupik Judy Wilson as a representative of them. She is phenomenal, and she brought a real critical Indigenous perspective to the table. She was guided by mandates provided by UBCIC Chiefs Council through their resolutions, and she provided animal welfare organizations such as the BC SPCA and fur bearers with insight on the UBCIC's principled approach to fur farming and wildlife management. So this is a way in which they consider Indigenous ways, title and rights, stewardship, conservation, and climate change impacts for any practice that they engage in. As an Indigenous person myself who worked for the animal welfare organization at the time, I really needed to make sure that we drive forward to colleagues and anyone involved in this advocacy specifically, that the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to harvest and trap native animals for cultural, ceremonial, and traditional purposes needed to be accounted for, not just considered. So as a sector, to be truly humane and in all intents and purposes to strive for justice, we had to acknowledge and recognize the impacts that colonialism has had and continues to have on Indigenous people's right to practice their culture. Our advocacy cannot interfere with the rights of Indigenous peoples to practice their culture as it relates to the use of animals, free of discrimination or interference as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I always think back to what happened many, many years ago when different animal rights and animal welfare organizations were trying to ban seal fur coming out of Canada, is that we could not continue to bulldoze over the voices of the community who depend on these for traditional and ceremonial as well as economic reasons and continue to harm the communities just for the sake of our own agendas. I didn't want us to be looking at the sad mink pictures the whole time. So I have some really happy wild mink here that were wonderfully submitted to the BC SPCA Wildlife and Focus Contest. So thank you for allowing me to share these. I love the one at the bottom specifically because you can see his little webbed toes. And I'm also a rodent person. I think that they have the cutest little faces. So mink are solitary, semi-aquatic animals. They range about 40 kilometers. They hunt, they forage, they go swimming, they sun themselves. These are all things that you could never think of them doing in captivity. And then when you consider that the cage standard size is less than 2 A4 pieces of paper put together, it really gives you the scale of how their lives are not able to be fully enriched when they're in that kind of environment. So I wanted to put together a quick little timeline and just go over it because this is something that is amazing. I think in real life scheme, it did not happen quick, given the fact that we're dealing with the fact that these animals in the height of the pandemic were passing the virus back and forth. But in terms of government policy change, it is actually quite quick, especially for us here in BC, where things usually take a longer approach and time. So the first COVID-19 outbreak happened on a BC fur farm in December of 2020. And then that was earlier in the month. And then by the end of the month, it was noted that there was also an outbreak on a second farm. To give you a bit of scale, the farms are all in relatively the same area. They're still technically the same municipality, however, on farmland. But if you kind of can put your brain back to 500 million years ago in December of 2020, the COVID restrictions that were happening then were very, very strict. Some areas were still in total lockdown. Lots of other places, there were only essential services open. So when you think about how the second farm had its outbreak is that the workers should not be going in between farms. The mink should not have been going in between farms. So you really do wonder, where did that COVID outbreak start? Was it someone bringing it into the farm? Was it something that was caught between the wild population and then the captive population, and then it went to the people? These are all questions that have never really been answered, but there's something to consider when you have these like hotbeds of viral activity. So on that second farm, at least 200 mink died of COVID or COVID-related complications. They were not humanely culled. So even just thinking about the poor welfare of the animals that had to die of COVID. By January of 2021, so just a month later, they culled 1,000 mink from one of those farms. We're not sure if it was one or two. It was never really disclosed. However, by March of 2021, just a couple months later, breeding was resuming. So that is the typical time to be breeding these animals. And as I mentioned before, that's when all the handling and the major part of human-animal interaction happens. Not only the fact that the population then increases fivefold during breeding season. So at this point, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs issued a moratorium on mink farming on April 6th of 2021, and that kind of came at the same time as a lot of animal welfare organizations and fur-bearing animal protection agencies calling on that. Just a month later, May of 2021, there was a third outbreak of COVID on a mink farm in BC. July of 2021 was the fourth outbreak, but the interesting thing about that one was that it was actually found via the testing of escaped mink. So they were not mink that were held in cages, they were farmed mink that had somehow escaped their enclosures and had left the farm area. So at this point, just thinking about this, resources from 3 ministries were being used in the height of a pandemic to monitor one mink farm and the surrounding area. You had the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of the Environment, and the Ministry of Health via the Public Health Office doing this. No one ever came out with the cost of that. No one ever told us why they were doing that, as opposed to just culling the mink to begin with, like they did in the EU. Due to the escaped mink, there was the potential for wild mink to be infected, which again could have caused another variant and would have just been almost impossible to contain because wild mink have such a long, far-ranging environment to go to. So after much publicity about the outbreak and lots of public pressure, the public health officer finally placed a moratorium on new mink farms, and the province announced a review of its policies and regulations in relation to fur farms. This was all again in like summer of 2021. Simultaneously, in August of 2021, the Code of Practice for the Care and Handling of Farmed Mink kind of got a sneaky little delay, as we all like to, I don't know about you, but I definitely like to blame everything on supply chain issues now. No matter what I'm doing, if I don't do it on time, it's because of the supply chain. But essentially, the fur farming industry snuck in a little pandemic delay, and they actually extended the deadline to move to larger cages. That still means that all of these mink are just living in these little tiny cages. October of 2021 was when UBCIC formally endorsed a resolution that called for the phasing out of fur farms in BC, which was huge news because it was only the only month after was when the province came out and announced that they would be phasing out the mink industry. Via the provincial health office here in British Columbia, they put restrictions on the farms, so they could not breed or purchase more mink. They wouldn't issue new licenses to farms, and essentially the industry would kind of peter out. As a side note, it doesn't employ a ton of people, maybe about 100 in the whole province, but animal welfare organizations in the BC SPCA in particular did put in a budget request with the BC government saying that they should budget and account for a dignified transition of the farm workers and the farm operators to other sectors in order to make it an easier change for them instead of just immediately shuttering those farms. Which is great. And then in February of 2022, a new federal bill was introduced by MP Erskine Smith, who represents Beaches East York. It's called Bill C-247, and it was a federal bill to end fur farming in Canada. So that's kind of where we're at now. But mink farming and the collaboration with UBCIC is just such a great example of First Nations governance organization working in partnership with animal welfare to change legislation. That it is no longer just the animal welfare organization's job to go in and say, this is what we want, that things needed to be accounted for to make sure, because UBCIC was just so crucial as the leading voice to push the government in realizing that there was no social license. We could bring them so many stats saying 65% of people don't, 85% of people don't agree in killing animals just for their fur. All of these things, but it wasn't until Kupuk Judy Wilson was able to be brought into those meetings and really drive that message home that they seemed to make any kind of changes. So it was also really crucial because the government was backed a little bit up in that it found out that agri-stability programs, which are taxpayer-funded insurance schemes to protect farmers, actually applied to mink farming, even though in your brain, when you hear farmer, you think like food or goods, I guess, something that's like valuable for domestic economies. So agri-stability is meant to protect these farmers from fluctuations in the market, like a drought or a weather condition or something, not meant to be propping up a failing industry. And the mink farms in BC had actually been receiving a ton of money. I don't remember the number completely offhand. It was, Melissa probably does. It's like $6.5 million over the last 5 years just to prop up this industry that wasn't even producing products for our economy. So onto the Jane Goodall bill, just a really quick overview of that is that actually in 2020, former Senator Murray Sinclair teamed up with Dr. Jane Goodall to introduce the Jane Goodall Act. So this is meant to protect captive great apes, elephants, and other non-domestic species, as well as banning the import of elephant ivory and hunting trophies into Canada. So this legislation actually builds on a 2019 law that banned the whale and dolphin captivity for entertainment purposes, the Cetacean Protection Act. And if and when the Jane Goodall Act is passed, this legislation would establish some of the strongest animal protection laws in the world, also including that limited legal standing for individual animals. After the Honourable Murray Sinclair retired, the bill is now being brought forward by Senator Marty Klein, who's Cree Métis, and it does currently sit in the Senate. So this updated bill, because when Parliament was prorogued during the election in 2020, is that they had the chance to update it. So the new updated bill not only phases out elephant captivity in Canada, it provides legal protections for great apes, big cats, bears, wolves, seals, sea lions, walruses, certain monkeys, and dangerous reptiles like crocodiles and giant pythons, just things that should not really be living either in captivity or in Canada at all. This legislation states that science, empathy, and justice require everyone to respect the biological and ecological characteristics of the needs of animals, and also bans new captivities of those species I listed unless they're licensed for their best interest, which is like non-harmful scientific research or their individual welfare, such as if they're injured or they're caught kind of mid being trafficked into the country. It also bans the use of all designated animals in performances. So that would mean no more animals being used in zoos or in aquarium shows, and also affords captive animals that limited standing under the law, as well as creating a permitting system for animal care organizations. So you couldn't just open up an elephant sanctuary and just receive all of these elephants, that it's a much more robust permit program. And it also represented a really unique coalition of animal welfare groups and accredited zoos, and was really a wonderful way to show this collaboration that can happen when government invites lots of different people to the table. While it aims to provide protections for animals in captivity in terms of their welfare, the stronger licensing requirements for registered zoos is also a really interesting piece, because that was something that the zoos themselves have been open to. So a wonderful way to kind of cut down on those roadside zoos and only allow the accredited, properly staffed facilities to have access to those animals. And personally, I also think it's the starting piece to national legislation as it relates to sentience of animals as an indicator for protection. What I eventually hope is that really similar to Aotearoa or New Zealand, is that we talk about personhood. So New Zealand has been taking the lead by granting personhood to rivers and lakes and mountains so that others can advocate for them on their behalf. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I jump to the Quebec sentience bill. The next one I wanted to bring up, along with this adorable picture, is a great success in 2017, which is the Awikano, the Kitasu, or the Hai Nation, the Nuxalk Nation, and the Heiltsuk Nation, created a specific group called the Central Coast Bear Working Group, and they worked with non-Indigenous NGOs to prevent and ban the trophy hunting of bears in their territories and across the Great Bear Rainforest here in BC. Those nations' combined territories stretch just over 45,000 square kilometers. And through the Coastal Bear Working Group, all four nations were able to coordinate their research methods to track and identify bears as they moved across the land. So again, collaboration amongst nations, and then as well with these animal welfare organizations. In December of 2017, which was 5 years after those nations imposed a tribal ban on trophy hunting, the BC provincial government finally enacted an official provincial ban. And this is after many years. I'm sure you guys had it in Ontario for a portion, but especially here in BC, when our Liberals were in power, they were all about the economic benefits. So this was like years and years of them claiming that these were much needed tourist dollars. You couldn't get rid of the grizzly bear hunt. How would outfitters survive? So actually between 1975, which was the first year that records were being kept, and 2016, hunters killed over 12,000 bears in the province. And even though the ban is in place, currently First Nations are still allowed to harvest for food, social and ceremonial purposes, or treaty rights. And this is a huge success because, as I mentioned, the provincial government previous to this was all about talking about those tourist dollars, when really data had long pointed to the fact that ecotourism and non-lethal guiding was the largest economic influx that you could have in the region over hunting. So, for example, previously you would pay about $20,000 to $25,000 to a guide in order to kill one bear. And let's say 250 bears are killed annually. So that's about $5 million a year. But those bears are now removed from the ecosystem. That was a one-time deal. No one else gets to put money towards that. So some stats then bring the economic value for ecotourism per bear in this framework to being over $6 million annually. So if you think of those 250 bears each being worth $6 million, again, like a gross capitalistic thing I don't want to think about, but it's just showing that there's all these different angles to the reasons why this shouldn't have been permitted, especially with the host nations talking about the fact that it was impacting their own cultural and ceremonial abilities. And the Owikinoan specifically think of bears and know bears as their kin, that they are also Huikino, and that you should not be just taking them for a trophy for their paws or for their head, that this is something where if you do need to kill one, it is for food, and that it is part of a wider ability to be living with them. Really wanted to quickly highlight, so there's Patrick Johnson on the left and Alec Willie. They're Owikino Coastal Guardian Watchmen. So they're the ones who actually are patrolling the shores and the water to make sure that hunters are not there. They're part of the region's environmental stewardship program. So they provide financial and logistical support to the Bear Project, and the Owikino Guardian Watchmen also assist the community with like camping trips to the backcountry and things like that. It's beautiful territory. As I mentioned, the Quebec sentience law has been a really major thing. It's that Quebec is the only jurisdiction in Canada to officially recognize animals as sentient beings. Across Canada, law is divided into protecting two classes of things: you're a people or you're a property. So this change in Quebec's legislation, while it lacks in a lot of ways, is still a really good indicator that there is a public appetite for this type of policy change at any level, provincial, federal, municipal. So again, if anyone can think of a corporation as a person, which under Canadian law we do, despite the fact that they lack sentience and humanity, then I don't really understand why this can't be extended to non-human animals as well as nature. The driving force of this legislative change was actually those most concerned about animals used for food or those held in captivity like labs and zoos and aquariums. But this really represented a shift, especially in a province like Quebec, to elected officials being brought into an Indigenous worldview of living in harmony amongst them as opposed to dominance over them. And then because the standard that New Zealand is setting and the ability to advocate and to grant personhood to specific areas and specific features, again, I hope that these things kind of spiral through the provinces and allow people to really take up this fight in a way that we can choose say what is sentient and what isn't, while acknowledging the fact that nature, while it may not be sentient, is still very much impacted by all of our actions, and that it is something that we need to care for as kind of a shared place for all of us. I did mention that I have a fail, so only wanted to bring up the one, and that is the renewed wolf call in British Columbia. So I have a lot to say about this as well, but it started basically in 2014, 2015, which was 2014, the BC provincial government released a really controversial wolf management plan to address declining caribou populations. Caribou are considered endangered here, and the provincial government was really quick to just blame wolves. Wolves are doing it. Surely they've killed the whole population. It couldn't be anything that we've been doing. And the reasons for that controversy is exactly that. There was a real lack of scientific evidence, both that the wolves were the main culprit and that culling them would then lead to the best solution, as well as an inherently inhumane methodology. They aerially kill wolves with machine guns. And no or very limited or insufficient consultation with Indigenous communities or consideration of First Nations existing caribou and wolf management strategies. So there was like kind of just a trifold of things going wrong there. However, it started with Gusto in 2015, and then kind of underpinning all of this was the fact that their government was very hesitant to implement any solutions that limited resource extraction from caribou habitats. That was essentially it. Again, if you can picture someone sitting at a desk and being like, it's those wolves killing all of these caribou, is like just no kind of ownership or any kind of blame assigned to the people that had been disrupting that area in the meantime. Lots of research shows that the damage and disruption to caribou habitat is the key factor in their population decline. It's also very interesting the areas where this is happening is the hotbed for resource extraction in BC, oil and gas pipelines, fracking, industrial, forestry, all of these things are just very concentrated in that region. And research continues to show that wolves tend to just take advantage of human-caused disturbances to move through caribou habitat, that we are enabling them to do this. So even if they were the culprit, we're the ones cutting down the forest to allow them that easy access. So it's possible to modify these disturbances to reduce encounters between caribous and wolves without killing them, but that would mean an end to those resource extraction activities. Recently, just fall of last year, the province sought feedback on a 5-year approval for the continued wolf killing. So again, it was 2015 to 2020, 2021, they put out this kind of feedback. Essentially, it was exactly what you thought. January of 2022, they released the results, and not surprisingly, 60% of respondents were opposed to culling wolves as the singular measure to protect caribou. It's like, joy, no duh. The top 3 recovery actions preferred by the respondents were habitat protection, habitat restoration, and habitat management. Again, not surprisingly, people who identified themselves as scientists, concerned citizens, or anyone associated with environmental or ecosystem protection, ecotourism, and then First Nations and Indigenous rights holder groups, they were more likely to oppose culling compared to people who identified as hunters or trappers, guide outfitters, or those associated with resource extraction. In 2013, so prior to BC even implementing this wolf management plan, there was actually a great study that found that the majority of wildlife professionals, as well as the general public, did not agree that you should kill one species to save another, even if that other species is endangered, and that most people do not think that that is ethical, because the strategy doesn't solve the problem when the habitat itself is at risk. So without reducing your habitat fragmentation and human disturbance, these things could be irreversible anyways. That is what the study ended up coming to the conclusion of. So unfortunately, despite this huge body of evidence, even things that happened way before, even after many, many people who participated in the call themselves spoke out against the ineffectiveness of it all, BC did renew the cull program for another 5 years, despite the clear opposition. And they also did not do any type of action to protect the caribou habitat. So shocked, not shocked face here. Research in 2020 and 2021 also found a lot of flaws in the analysis for wolf control as a conservation measure. So even the own science that the government has been basing this on has been found multiple times to be flawed. It says that restoring disrupted habitat, so any roads and seismic lines for oil and gas, that you can do all of that without killing predators, and that in itself is effective at reducing wolf encounters with caribou. Sorry, that was probably a bit of a roundabout way of doing it. But essentially, you can do your destroying of the earth in a slightly better way, and even that improves the situation of both the caribou and the wolves. And no one was even looking at that. And then studies that tend to support the call also use modeling based on an unbalanced statistical approach. So they say that wolf culling and maternal penning treatments explained caribou recovery no better than when the habitat was altered or just by random chance. So you still can't weight those studies that the government is basing their policy off of. Culling efforts to date have resulted in few, if any, measurable benefits to the caribou, as mentioned. And again, a horrifying aspect that I don't think enough people are talking about is that killing from helicopters as well is not humane, that these are not actual hunters and trappers going out. These are people who, I picture like one of those, the scenes from like an old Vietnam movie where they're hanging out the side of the plane with a machine gun. That's what I picture, because that's what happened. And the American Veterinary Medical Association recognizes that gunshot is an acceptable method for killing free-ranging wildlife, but only under the condition that the bullet targets the brain. They note that if you try to place the heart or the neck, it's very, very challenging for accuracy, and that a humane death is like, even with the most skilled shooters, that you're still stressing them out, and then there's no way to confirm that the death was quick and painless. So like, when you think of the distance that they're up there in the helicopters anyways, the chances of them getting a good shot in a way to nicely end the wolf's life is just not going to happen. So even the amount that the government is funding in terms of the fuel, in terms of the manpower to do this, is just a terrible method in which to do it. Culling itself, the fact that they're just kind of zooming around the area and not actually basing it on specific packs or specific animals, is that culling has also been noted to fracture pack social structures. And it creates an ecological imbalance for all the other species in the area, not just in the positive way for the caribou. The cull in BC specifically does not meet the 7 international consensus principles for ethical wildlife control. That's not to say, I wanted to make a note that there are some First Nations that support wolf culling as a part of their own caribou management and recovery programs. There are 2 here, West Moberly First Nation and Salto First Nation. They formed an Indigenous Guardian program as part of an agreement with the provincial and federal governments, which does include a wolf cull as kind of like a short-term stopgap, but that the majority of the work needed to be done on habitat restoration. So this agreement included the eventual creation of a new provincial park, which is going to be over 200,000 hectares, and it also places an interim protection on over 550,000 hectares in a mountainous area that's going to be east of Mackenzie and west of Chetwynd and Hudson's Hope, if you're familiar with your BC Peace geography. However, a caveat to that is that unlike most areas of the Peace region where those First Nations are based, it is not a hotbed. The only active industry in the area is non-industrial forestry. There's some coal tenures there, but it certainly doesn't have the extensive fracking, conventional oil and gas development and mining that's happening everywhere else in the region. And that 30-year partnership with the First Nations does not cover the remainder of the southern caribou mountain herds. That area is covered by a second, far less detailed caribou announcement that obviously the government did not want to put first and foremost. That's provincial and federally managed, and it focuses on measures like continued wolf and moose kills, and it also keeps the door ajar for new BC government logging approvals and critical habitat for the caribou. So again, not addressing the very key point of this, which is something that has been brought up by First Nations and by Indigenous communities forever, is that you cannot just do one measure without looking at the entire picture. So yeah, the provincial government said that they are developing a plan to reduce habitat disturbance, which I find is also a very interesting word, but they don't have any type of fixed timeline for that. And because it's not in partnership with any First Nations, there's very little accountability coming from the government there. Sorry, I need a water. I get all jazzed up when I talk about bad government decisions. So going back to UBCIC, as I mentioned, they were involved in kind of coming out against the wolf cull as a measure on its own. The cull does conflict with Indigenous traditional values, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs has called to the wolf cull program, stating, "Wolves are a sacred species that Indigenous peoples have coexisted with since time immemorial. Habitat destruction, not wolves, are responsible for the decline of caribou species. And in February of 2022, UBCIC Chiefs Council passed a resolution that stated the BC government must advance a selective approach that respects First Nations jurisdiction and territorial management, supports caribou habitat and recovery areas, and does not jeopardize First Nations caribou recovery programs and efforts. Meaning that while a cull can be part of a management program, especially as I mentioned that short-term solution, a wider plan regarding habitat protection led by Indigenous communities ought to be the priority. The Indigenous Guardians program is also becoming quite popular, but the caveat to that is that it is in partnership with provincial and federal governments, so there is a lot of negotiation to make sure that the communities are getting what they want out of those deals and that they will end up having, like to think of it as veto power, but just more of a lead in that rather than the government and rather than kind of the ministries that are typically associated with this. The wolf call also in particular has jumped around many different ministries. I think it's a bit of a lemon that no one wants to deal with instead of just ending it, is that it has moved through the various forms of what we used to call the forestry, lands and resource development, and then now it's called like land and water and resource development. And it's just, many names happening there. So that's all that I have for the presentation. Thank you all so much for listening. I didn't have my timer running, so I have no idea how long that was or if I was speeding through it, but here's my contact information if anyone wants to get in touch with me, talk more about it. As I mentioned, I'll chat your ear off about mink. And this is just something that I've been so interested in. So thank you. And thank you, Natasha, for manning this. I don't see anything in the chat here, but I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so we can go back to it.
Thank you, Alison. That was wonderful, and I can hear your passion. I did not know of the mink. It's something to really think about, and they are super cute. We literally just seen a mink. We think it was a mink that just crossed our road. I think it was yesterday. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard of mink farms. I've just never really thought too much about it. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
But your mink was probably headed to the water.
I would hope so. That's, it's always a hope. It was like a little bit of a swampy area, so hopefully he was, or she was quite happy where it was.
Yeah.
But it's so lovely to see mink in the wild. It's hard to envision them in a cage.
Yeah, I know, especially being semi-aquatic and the fact that they just don't have access to any of that. Like the cages, I was quite, as someone who has worked in animal welfare and has seen some really horrific situations that animals have been in, I was honestly very disturbed at how they house them. And because again, they're wild, they're hand raised, but like mink are not super friendly animals. The way that they feed them is that they just put the food over top of the cages and then it drips down and then their droppings drip down. So like they don't even get the sensation and to fulfill the need to like hunt something. Like it's just kind of dropped on them. It's very dystopian.
Yes. So Melissa has a question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about when nations disagree on an issue, solutions to an issue? How do nations reconcile those differences?
Yeah, of course. So a really good example is actually the West Moberly and Salto, who are working together on that caribou habitat. So a lot of those kinds of disagreements are really only for nations where their traditional territories are overlapped or where they have claim to it. For the most part, most nations do agree on certain aspects of things. But I think here in BC, because of the unceded nature of the land, that very few nations have any type of treaty in place, it's just that extra level of difficulty, especially when it relates to resources, because I think it's a really terrible situation that colonialism has put our communities in, and that they essentially hold money in front of us and say, if you want economic viability, if you want your people to live well, we have to destroy your land. That's like kind of the caveat, that you have to agree to LNG, that you have to agree to this pipeline or this mine, when it shouldn't be that situation anyways. That nations should have the ability to steward their land and not lose money on it. So I don't really have an answer to that, like how would they reconcile it? It's kind of like when you're fighting with your family. It's different for each one. But I think that in terms of this kind of wildlife management, most of them are in agreement that it needs to be that more holistic Indigenous viewpoint of everything being connected instead of just one problem with one solution, and that's completely removed from this other huge web of things that are going on. Thanks, Melissa. And do you know the number for how much agri-stability was? Is it 6.5 million over 5 years? Yeah, 6.5. Thanks. Yeah, Valley.
Hi, Allison.
Hi, Valley.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was so thorough, so much information, and I feel like I need to call you and like pick your brain about like all the things. Yeah, I'm like super interested in personhood, and I'm also interested in wildlife welfare. And I don't know if I really have a question, more like maybe you could chat about this, but like, how do you think that personhood, integrating an Indigenous worldview and policy and law that would, grant personhood to animals, and not just companion animals, but wildlife as well, and wildlife that is outside of the care or captivity or of humans, or even like trophy hunting. So just, wild animals that are living their wild lives without any sort of human association. And I'm just wondering, like, beyond the advocacy that we could take on their behalf, how would an Indigenous worldview kind of shape those policies? I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah.
okay.
Well, I think the whole idea of granting personhood to things that are not persons is like very much in tune with this like Indigenous worldview kind of scheme. And like I always go back to kinship of like almost every single community that I have known, that I've interacted with, has just long since held, which is completely different from like the white Christian ideology of like dominance over the world and the animals below you, and that it's like people and then God and that's it, is like there's a really great Indigenous scientist, Jessica Hernandez, who talks about kinship ecology, that this is something that we need to be thinking of as more relational, that if you found out that your mom was getting shipped off to a slaughterhouse, that would bug you, or that would make you sad, and like try to kind of move in your life with that. So I think in terms of personhood as it relates to animals is a lot of an easier sell, because I think that even a lot of non-Indigenous people can relate to that. Anyone who has a pet, anyone who kind of has loved animals, knows that they have, for all intents and purposes, everything that we would need to consider a person, if not being a better person than most people. But I think that the stretch of that will kind of be the way that New Zealand is doing it, where they're granting that to rivers and mountains. Because how do you kind of you can protect the water, but if it's flowing through multiple areas, like granting personhood to the river is kind of whose jurisdiction is it? And like that is, I think, a bit more where they're finessing, and where the Indigenous worldview and people who are so much more eloquent and more have way more knowledge than me are the ones that should be centered. Because I think that if Indigenous priorities were brought to the forefront as that happened, it would cause such a huge economic disruption. But at the same time, I think that is what we need to be on the right track, is people actually legitimately talking about their kinship with the water, because the water is the home of the fish, and that the water is what gives us water to drink, and that the water is what is kind of maintaining this landscape through erosion, and just all of these things that I think in kind of a Euro-Christian colonial viewpoint is just not of concern, that no one's brain goes to that. It goes to, how can I make money from this? So that's kind of the like not so short answer, but it is a very exciting. In New Zealand, it is led by Maoris. Again, smaller country, whole different shtick, but like I think that that's something that Canada could very easily get behind. And it's kind of the way that we're going with Indigenous protected conservation areas, is that IPCAs are where Indigenous communities are able to take the lead. And I think that as more time goes on and we're able to continually study, and they kind of translate those things into Western science so that it's out to a broader audience, is that I would be shocked and flabbergasted and just like aghast if you tell me that an IPCA is in worse condition after being under guardianship of an Indigenous community. I just don't think that would happen.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know if you've heard, just a side note, but I don't know if you've heard of like predominantly Indigenous academics who put like a river. Oh, sorry, my battery's low. Back. They put like a river or like a mountain or something as an author, a co-author on their papers. And that's like a really interesting way to grant personhood to, you know, a sentient or non-sentient being that, you know, has contributed to the research. I think that's really a really cool way to kind of decolonize research involving you know, plants and animals and rivers and mountains. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks, Sally. Natasha, have you ever done that in all of your academic writing?
No, but it's a thought, and I haven't done a lot of academic writing, but it's an interesting thought. I know we have many discussions with people about asking people to think about like thinking of that we're a part of nature, not above nature, and that we don't have control over nature, and how things have a rippling effect with what we do has a long-term rippling effect, and it's always a wonder of how long of a rippling effect. Are we talking like our generation, or 2 or 3 generations, or 7 generations of an effect? And what do we want to see for our great grandchildren? Do we want them to have like I know we talked to you about the whitefish decline in Georgian Bay. Do we want whitefish in Georgian Bay? And what can we do to help them? And the whole ecosystem of Georgian Bay. You know, how can we help Georgian Bay's ecosystem? Because they need little tiny shrimp type things to eat, all the way up to when, as they mature, different things to eat as they go along. And if those things are missing, just like any species, they go hungry and they may not carry on. So how do we protect that habitat? Or how do we, I don't know how you would refurbish it, but like, how do you protect it? How do you, and that's, I think, with a lot of the other ecosystems of protecting or rehabilitation of them, it's a big task, because you have to look at every species that lives there and every species of what it needs and how it supports one another. So it takes a lot of time, but then to realize that by affecting one, by taking one out or removing one or limiting one, that you're affecting other ones. And it's not up to us to do that. So I think it's a form of control that we have to sometimes. I have a really hard time thinking. I don't know, there might be some really good examples out there. I just can't think of any examples of when men or people have been have introduced a species or tried to control one species and have been successful at it, by bringing one species in to control another species or whatever it is. I have yet been able to think of a really good example of that.
Yeah. Usually you think of the fails, right? The like rabbits in Australia, or you think of that Simpsons where they just keep like bringing in snakes to eat the lizards and then monkeys to eat the snakes, and then, oh my gosh. Yeah, it's like, and that's something that I think is so hard for our society to kind of understand, even though we're really just being slapped in the face with it now, is like, how easy is it to ruin one species and to take that species out of the ecosystem? And then how difficult is it to try to get back? And yeah, should we even be fussing around with it? That's such a great point.
I think, sorry, Alison, I think, Natasha, like the one example that I can think of is the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone that like then rebuilt rivers because the deer then lived in a landscape of fear. They stopped eating all of the aspen grew. Then that, I think that's like kind of the only example that where humans have reintroduced a species to that actually made like a positive effect on the ecosystem there. But I don't know if I can think of anything else. I'm like racking my brain.
And also like an enclosed ecosystem,
Very
right? In the park.
specific.
Yeah.
Very specific.
Lots of staff monitoring, lots of resources.
Totally. But yeah, I think that's it, right? Like that's kind of the only example that's a very controlled environment that I can think of, racking my like wildlife conservation brain. But yeah, it's a really good point.
Yes, it's amazing how much I've been hearing about caribou in the last few days. I was just thinking about that as you were talking. It's a little sad, but it's top of mind with a lot of people, and habitat seems to be not the only concern, but it's one of the possible solutions is putting aside more habitat for them and giving them the space, and then also putting all those pieces that they need to survive in that habitat, or not disrupting that habitat.
Yeah, it is like a special form of human hubris where we can be like, let's just put a mine here, I'm sure everything will be fine.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, control, and when people think they can change rivers and what have you, and then they scratch their heads when the river goes back to the original spot.
Yeah. Who could have guessed?
Exactly. So I know it's like 8:32. If there's any other questions or comments, I would love to give everybody the opportunity to chime in.
Yeah. Otherwise, thank you so much for recording this and streaming it to anyone watching live right now. But thank you so much for having me, Natasha. It's wonderful. It's always good to see you. I don't see any Aquaman around you, but it's great to see you, I guess.
Next time. Next time, Aquaman will be able to sit in.
Oh, good.
But I thank everybody for joining us out there in Facebook world, and this will be going to YouTube. And yes, thank you, Alison. It's always great to talk to you, and great memories from the sort of kind of a damp day, but I'm sure you're used to that kind of weather from the West Coast, when we took that short little tour of the area. And I always think of those little newts that we found. I came across those pictures today, and a lot of good memories.
Yeah, I was so humbled to be taken around the land and just see the amazing everything, like from a beach full of fossils. So yeah, the little newt, and being able to pick up all that garbage on the way and just really enjoy. I had such a fabulous time, and it was somewhere that was just unlike anywhere else I had ever been. So thank you so much. I really appreciate being included in this. Thanks for all your well wishes in the chat.
Thank you guys, and thank you everybody, and thank you, Alison, and everybody stay well, and we'll keep in contact with Bagida'waad. We're always up to something.
Up to something.
Always something.
Bye, everyone.